Everyone, and welcome to Primetime at the Bethel University Library. Primetime is a collaboration of the Friends of the Bethel University Library and many offices on campus, whose mission is to encourage lifelong learning beyond the classroom in the entire Bethel community. And I'll give you an appetizer for the next one before we talk about this one. On Tuesday, March 13th, join us as Peyton Nostbush and Steve Olson reflect on their interaction with Egypt's Christians during their January 2012 interim study abroad course, Ligatures of Faith, led by Dr. Dan Ritchie. You'll hear the Egyptian stories of persecution in the context of their deep historically rooted Christian faith. Today, we are going to welcome Edgren scholars Dr. Stephen Self and Grant McEachern, who will present their project, Modena F 9.9, Clues from an Italian Renaissance Manuscript. I'll tell you more about that in just a minute. Let me say a little something about the Edgren Scholars Program, however, that makes this possible. It's a program that supports faculty-student research teams who collaborate on a research project. The project must be one that has the potential to make a significant contribution to a given field of study, and the project must reflect meaningful collaboration on research between students and faculty. The Edgren Scholars Program is named after John Alexis Edgren, the founder of what we now know as Bethel University, and his vision for higher education is evidenced in many ways at Bethel. For example, this focus on collaborative research between student and faculty reflects Edgren's own vision for the educational process. One of his key educational principles, which he articulated in the 19th century, probably ahead of his time, was that, quote, the relation between teachers and pupil shall not be that of commander and subject, but one of true friendship and helpfulness. Darn. It's interesting to note that Edgren said that the relationship between students and teachers is not that of commander and subject, and he had spent considerable time in the military services, so he knew what the commander-subject relationship was like, and he knew that was not the right model for students and teachers. Rather, he characterized the student-teacher relationship as one of friendship and helpfulness. I think, to be serious for a minute, that's what we at Bethel believe deeply in, and it's wonderful that we have the Edgren program as a way to foster that kind of collaboration between faculty and students. Dr. Self and Grant worked as a collaborative editing team to create a modern edition of the Modena F 9.9 manuscript collection of late 15th century popular Italian works. Now I'll have to explain that part to you, which is some of the earliest evidence that exists of a Renaissance Italian musical tradition. Let's welcome Stephen and Grant.
This is the kind of presentation that I really love, because I'm just going to sit down over there for the most part and let Grant talk. But I wanted to give just a few words of explanation about it. And first of all, I want to thank the university for this opportunity. In music circles, it's pretty unusual for undergraduates to be able to have this kind of research opportunity. We work very collaborative, really about as collaboratively as things like this can work, I think, and we would check each other's work, challenge each other's ideas, and that sort of thing. And it all culminated really last weekend when we were able to present a paper based on our research, a little bit deeper than what we'll be going into today, for a musicology conference down at Wake Forest University in North Carolina. And to show you how unusual it is for undergraduates to do this sort of thing, just about every other paper was either by a faculty person, an independent scholar, or a doctoral student in musicology. So it was really a great opportunity for us to show the kind of program that we have here and be able to talk about the work that we had done. And with that, I'll turn it over to Grant.
So in this presentation, I'd just kind of like to give you an idea of what our project was, what we went through, the different processes that we had to do to really accomplish the goal that we set out to do. So let's just start out with the purpose. We said it was to create a complete edition of this Modena manuscript in modern notation. This is a manuscript that hadn't previously been transcribed completely in its full, and so we hope that it would shed new light on how music of this era progressed from a basic oral tradition to the four-voice music of the late Fratella. Before we actually delve into the transcription process, I'd like to give you an idea of what music history of this era really deals with. So before the Fratella, which is the area we deal with, we have the Crescendo, which is a period of more sophisticated three-voice Italian polyphony. It's kind of a pre-Renaissance era, and it's very high in comparative to the other styles of the day, like the French styles. The Trecento music was very well known and very just much more complex than the other styles of the day. Now this continued until about 1420s, where it gave way to the Quattro Tendo. And this time period is really just an era where there was no documented music. Very little is known. It was just kind of, it seems to be a time of oral tradition, and much of this mystery is really what we're trying to figure out with this, this manuscript and this new information that we now have. And then this brings us to the Frodola, which was characterized by simple 3 or 4 voiced Italian polyphony. And it really wasn't that complex, but it was written down and notated, and really you can see a development through it. And then the madrigal, which is the high point of Italian Renaissance music, and really what most people would consider to be the only real Italian Renaissance music in many circles. So a little more in depth to the areas we're discussing. The Quattro Tendo, it refers more specifically to the time period than the sort of music that it was characterized by. It stretched from about 1420 to 1500. And we can assume that this was an oral tradition, a period of oral tradition of music composition and performance. But this isn't really documented evidence by any means. This is strictly because there was no evidence available. So we can assume if they're not writing it down, they must be just singing it. So some hypotheses have been made to say that maybe this was because it was dominated by the French styles of the day, such as the chanson, or maybe there were just fewer active Italian musicians. But really there's no strict, this is what happened during the time period, and that's what we're trying to figure out. The assumed paradigm of the time period was that it was a well-known melody, was generally just sung, and sung to a text of a poem, and it was accompanied by improvised harmonies in thirds and sixths, very similar to what we might hear today. The Frodola, then, started around the 1470s and continued to about 1530. This was the starting point of this is more ambiguous because manuscripts just sort of start popping up. We see manuscripts like our Modena F that contains this written down music, and not much is really known about where it came from, how early it was written, or anything, but we do have some documented evidence. Centered around northern Italy, and in these manuscripts we see some diversity of style, where there is just some simple harmonies, or to even maybe 4-voice polyphony, and is featured rhythmically and thematically simple texts. It was characterized by the works of Caro and Tromboncino, who are the two most prolific and probably most influential Frodola writers of the time period, and more importantly in much musicology circles, it led to the Italian madrigal. But what we'll focus on is really how it became the Frodola and how that shift took place. So our specific manuscript is called the MS Alpha F9.9, but more commonly referred to as Modena F. It was compiled in Padua, Italy, and now resides in the Modena Biblioteca Estensa library. It was compiled around 1490. The dating is very ambiguous because there are several Roman numerals that basically just say it was done in this year in the Olympiad, and then make some reference to the Jewish calendar. I can't even begin to really understand it, and many people have tried to date it and generally come up with somewhere in the mid-1490s. We do know it was compiled as a gift from Magister Joannes to Franciscus Stepha. We don't know anything about those people, but we know that they had it at some point. And it was made as a presentation manuscript. This means it wasn't necessarily like scores of music used for singing specifically. So the how accurate it wasn't very important. It was more important that it looked good. So you see a lot of very colorful writing, like you can see there, and it is just very ornate and beautiful, and probably something that would be sitting on a coffee table in someone's house rather than sung by musicians. There were originally 104 songs in the manuscript, but now only 82 have survived in some amount. This comes from missing folios or other damage, but for the most part the manuscript is still in fairly good condition. And now I'd like to give you a glimpse of what the manuscript looks like. This is on the website of the Biblioteca Estensa in Modena, Italy. And as you can see here, there's just lots of very ornate things. These are like the dedication, and here's the table of contents. And get you to some of the music here. There's some of the dating. All right, here's what the music actually looks like. You have the 4 different voices with space allotted for them. The contours voice is in the top, which is more of the melody line. Then the tenor, you turn your head sideways, you can kind of read tenor there, or tenori. And then the second page of the folio, these would be back to back, or like this, so you're reading it. You have the altus voice and the bassus voice. And so each one has its own line, and the text would be written in the middle and also underneath the cantus line. So just an idea of what it looks like and what we were working with. And they would like to include some pretty pictures, which I'm sure, like that picture of a head there, we don't really know quite why. But it was all in the intent of making it look good. All right. So, why did we choose this manuscript to work with? Being that it was in 1490 or so, it was fairly early in what we have as far as documented evidence of the era. And the statement that we made is that it reflects the humanistic principles and interests of Renaissance Italy in their musical infancy. But what that more specifically means is that it was very early on. We see a large variety of works, and this probably means that it's representative of a fairly large time period, possibly as early as the beginning of the 1400s. And this gives us some real specific clues to the mystery of what happened in Quattro Tendo, what the music was like, and how it may have progressed into this higher polyphony. So then, what exactly we did this summer? We started off by transcribing Modena 9 into modern notation. This was a fairly extensive process and took a lot of time, considering there's 82 songs that we had to transcribe. And I'll go more into detail of what that process was like in a little bit. Then we transferred that into computer notation, and in that more manipulable context, we were able to analyze it and really make a statement about what it says about the music of this era, both thematically and conceptually, and how they conceived of it as music. So, transcription. It's the process of getting from this to this. Very simple, but a little more of what that's like. Some of the basics here. There are 6 basic types of notes that you see in this sort of notation. There's the longa, which is roughly equal to our double whole note, and the brevis, which is more equal to our whole note. The semibrevis, which just means half, short, which is more like our half note. The minima, or shortest, quarter note, and then semiminima, which is shorter than shortest, 8th note. and fusa, which we very rarely see, but occasionally, which is the 16th note. And these relations aren't exact, like the duration isn't necessarily exactly brevis for a whole note, but if you changed it, you could say maybe the longa is equal to a whole note, and that would mean the brevis is equal to a half note. And so this is a relation that we used, but other transcribers would use a different relation depending on the pieces. So, what do these notes look like? Maybe a little hard to see, but here you have a longa, which is just an extended rectangle with a line on it. This is generally used only at the cadences or at the end of pieces. And it was kind of one of those where when you see one of those, you just kind of keep singing, and you stop when you're done. And it's just long. It's singing for an extended period of time. Then you have brevis, or short, which is a little box-like shape, which you can see in a few places here. And next to that you have the semibrevis, which is more of a diamond shape. The minima, which has the tail here. And the semi-minima, which was colored in with the stem. And the fusa would have a tail on it at the top of the stem, much like our eighth notes do today. And for some of you who are quick at transcribing, you may have realized that these are the same song. So you can see this long, short, 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 long pattern. You can look at it that closely. I don't know if you can see it, but I thought you might enjoy to see the correlation between the two. Some other characteristics of transcription that we had to deal with are ligatures, which are notated in that box there. These are when notes are combined together or stretched out. You see in those oblique patterns. And this is a specific type of notation where you can tell how they wanted it to be done rhythmically. So a box like that would have been short, short, with two brevises, and then if it was multiple in a row, it would be short, short, long. There's nothing intrinsically different about this notation. Like when you see something like that, it doesn't mean that you're supposed to sing it differently. But it was just a different way of notating this duration and this set of notes. Another thing we saw was coloration, where the notes were colored in and they were all darkened. And this denotes the change to triple meter from duple meter. So see some examples of those. The ligatures, you can see here, where you have two combined like this, just right on top of each other, or right here as well. They can span any number of notes. All that means is that it's short, semibrevis here, semibrevis there, and here you can see a ligature in oblique and box combined together. Coloration, on the other hand, you would see extended patterns like that, and the movement would be in a more triple form. So you'd have 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, and 1. And so that way you could switch back and forth from triple to duple meter. So some of the problems that we dealt with. If you look at the little green line, it looks like it's actually moving. But, some of the problems that we dealt with here are missing parts, or entire folios or other sections were missing an extra notes in the manuscript, in the notation, where there were errors, and just wrong notes in general. Some examples of missing parts. There's one folio that we found water damage in, where we actually lost the second half of the Bosses part, and there's really no way to recover it, and the water damage existed on the other side of the folio as well, though it didn't actually conflict with any of the notes. It just took out the space of the manuscript. Another thing, there are missing folios all over the place. You'll see stretches where it goes from, like here, this is the first page of the manuscript, and the words are Piango al mio tormenti. The very next page, it's Miserere Mei, and this is the 4th page of the manuscript, so we can assume that the middle folios are just entirely ripped out, and you'll see that time and time again, where like here it jumps from I think it's like 7 to 14 or something, and you just have these large sections that are just missing entirely. And so we end up with half songs in many of the cases, where, let's see, let's go back to the Miserere Mei, where we only have 2 parts to the song, and we're missing the cantus and tenor parts. And the reverse for this one, where we have the cantus and tenor, but we have no bass or alto. And there's really no way to reconcile that. Yeah, we can't come up with a new melody to match harmonization. There is, if we wanted to make a performable edition, we could maybe construct a bass part, but it would be very informal, it wouldn't be very official, and we couldn't submit it by any means. We couldn't analyze that because it's our own creation. So, identifying missing and extra notes and wrong notes. There's generally 2 ways to recognize this. This happens when the voice parts don't line up with each other at the end of cadences, or there would be pauses or fermatas, generally halfway through the piece as it lines up with the text, or at the very end. And we would find the different parts, one part way and 3 or 4 measures later than another part, and that obviously wouldn't normally be the case. That's not how it was meant to be. So we have to assume there's a mistake somewhere in there. Maybe extra notes, maybe a section was doubled up, and then we would just adjust it to fit with the rest of the parts. Another way we found it was in vertical dissonance. Music of this time period was very consonant, very much so in 5/3 chords, and it wouldn't have any sort of 7ths or 4ths or those notes where you hear a clash, like Eric Whittaker would not have done well in this time period. So these are pretty clear, and we can see, okay, this note clearly doesn't fit. What was it meant to be? Was it meant to be there at all? So in this reconciliation process, we had to really make sure our priorities were straight. Very easily, we could just make it sound good, or come up with something, well, this clearly would be a good way to do it, this would fix the problem. But our first priority always had to be maintaining the manuscript's integrity, making the smallest changes to make it fit, even if it wasn't necessarily the best fit, but still workable. And we would try to get into the minds of the people writing it, or the people transcribing, or whoever happened to be adding the calligraphy or the pretty pictures on the side, and just try to understand, well, what they were thinking, what might they have messed up with. We had several points where there were lines that were put on the wrong part of the staff, and so we had to just assume, well, this line is clearly a third too high, and it was probably just when they switched staffs, they meant it to be there, or other small changes like that. Just one other part of the transcription process that I'd like to briefly mention is when we were dealing with things in perfection. This is a term that refers to when the piece is in a triple meter rather than a duple meter, and the exact duration of the notes wasn't necessarily notated. You would find brevises and semibrevises next to each other and arranged in ways that didn't quite fit up if you just took them for their note value, and so they had to be lengthened or made into triplet groupings in order to notate them correctly. They added in dots between them to show when things were supposed to be a grouping. So you would find like a couple notes, a dot, several more notes, a dot, just to show that this group of notes was here, this group of notes went there. What this looks like in the manuscript. Here we have a circle in the mensuration sign, which shows that it was in a triple meter. And the note grouping would be sort of a 1, 2, 3, and 1, 2, 3, or sorry, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, where these two notes have both been lengthened by a beat to make up full measures. Sometimes it was very hard to tell how this is supposed to be done. Hopefully there would be dots. Other times we had to look at the other parts and match them up to make sure that we were doing it correctly and not adding or changing notes. So, final product. Should be able to have you guys listen to some of these here. Here is Un giorno ma fortuna. And see if I can do it here. So, as you can see in this, there are a lot of different notes that we would make in our manuscripts or in our transcriptions to show the changes that we've made. This was a fairly complex piece. You can see it is in a duet form, and this was very uncommon in the era. Normally it was just this very simple four-voice, like what you see here, where the four voices just line up with each other. A couple notational things. We had added ficta, or sharps and flats in cadence points where we would have assumed they would have either sharped or flatted the note. And this would have been something they just sung, because, of course, everyone knows that when you're in this sort of pattern, you sharp the note. And it was just a common thing. They wouldn't have written it down in many cases, because who would have not done it? We also added these brackets like this to notate when there were ligatures, so that we could see where those came into play. And I don't have one of them in here, but when it was coloration, we would add a dotted bracket above it and put it in a triplet form. This piece also has a change from 4/4 to 3/2, and this was notated by 3 in the manuscript. And I think that's about it. Yep. Oh, and also we added these little, that thing, I don't know quite what to call it.
A bow.
A bow, sure. Carrot. And that was where the end of the line was on the page, so that we could see the direct, the direct relation between this and between the manuscript itself. I think for the sake of time we won't listen to any of the others there, but they're similarly themed, and the music, it really is very pretty, and it's enjoyable. I actually found one of the songs I particularly liked and like to sit down and play sometimes. We're moving on. So after we did all this, we have all of this new information about the era. What do we do with it? And so our analysis kind of took place in focusing on one thing, and this was the altus voice. Music of the time period before this had been generally 3-voice, which would have cantus singing the melody, and then tenor singing harmony, and the bass voice supplying another lower harmony. But this kind of gradually became not as exciting, and so musicians started to add an alto's voice. And so this was done in many different ways, and we analyzed the ways in which that was done. Sometimes there were altoses that had been merely just kind of forced in, and you can really tell because they didn't line up very well. They jumped all over the place. They had random rests in measures where clearly the person coming up with the alto's voice couldn't figure out a better note to put in that area. But there were also some where the altos was clearly intended, and this shows a much more developed format. So then we set out to try to create a progression of how this music developed and how exactly it was written. So this slide I actually took straight from our presentation that we gave this past weekend. This was just our thesis. Most of the paper was spent explaining how we can come to this thesis rather than the actual transcription process, but the thesis is still the same. So first, we can assume that there was melody that was just created for a poetic text. This is probably what happened in much of the Quattro Tendo time period, where they would just be singing this popular, well-known tune to a text that had been created specifically for this sort of melody. And then, in the interest of more harmonic weight, they would add a tenor and bosses. The tenor would generally be in parallel sixths and thirds, and the bosses would be more harmonic foundation. Sometimes maybe it was the bosses was played by an instrument, but we didn't really do much into analyzing that. So then they would add the alto's voice, and sometimes this was intended from the beginning, as you can see in the song that I just played, the Romo, and sometimes it was added more as an afterthought. And again, that was very clear, and we can definitely see that progression in the manuscript. And then it moved to all four voices being obligatory, and the polyphony expanded, and where we see duets between voices, and where clearly the altos is intended, and it just has a lot more harmonic, gratifying weight to it. And that is our project. Thank you.
Are there any questions? We'll both try to answer them if we can.
Sure.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about how you divided the labor? Or was this the model? Did you just sit around, Stephen, and let Randy roll the next
Yeah. I really wasn't even on campus last summer, but we each took chunks of the manuscript and created initial paper transcriptions. And then we would check each other's against the original. And then after we had the whole thing transcribed on manuscript paper, then we put it into computer, and we just divided that up too. And then we read secondary literature. The first thing, the transcribing, which is very interesting, but that's really kind of only the first step. You just have to have the stuff in a notation that you can make sense of before you can start analyzing it. And so after we had the transcriptions done, then we started reading secondary literature, and we divided up the articles that we did and talked about what they might have to say to us. And yeah, so it was just collaborative all the way along.
How did you select that particular manuscript or piece of music just to begin with?
I knew that it had a lot of repertoire that might give some clues as to how Italian secular music of the 1400s had developed, but I didn't know that. We didn't come into it with any preconceptions as to what it would tell us. But I knew that it really wasn't available as a complete work in modern edition. And so if nothing else, every manuscript can tell you something. It may not tell you the sexiest thing around, but it will tell you something. And so we just we decided to. I thought that would be a good one for us to do, and then we would find out what it had to say to us.
Do you have plans to commission this work to any ensemble to record it and then use it for any? I don't know.
Grant, you want to talk about it?
Sure. We have been in contact a little bit with a director at Georgetown University who has an ensemble that is strictly focused on early music, generally madrigals, and so the Fado would fit in very well with their repertoire. We've talked with them a little bit, but nothing has really been moving thus far. We've been working on getting the text inlaid on all the works as well as translated so that we can be sure the text is accurate. But I don't know, I think it would be fun at some point to get maybe chamber ensemble here at Bethel together and sing a selection.
Look, the text is a real issue, not just because neither of us is fluent in Italian, but this is Renaissance Italian. And so I've been in contact with a faculty member at the University of Minnesota who herself, from the Italian Studies Department, who is a native Italian speaker, and she said, I'll help you out if you can't find anybody else, but I'm not really sure how well I can do all of this. So it's just that's an issue that you have to deal with. And frankly, we just ran out of time at the end of the summer. But you'd have to deal with the text and figure out how to place it exactly, and then how to, if you noticed in the text, there was part of it underlaid, and then there was all this other stuff that was just extra. Well, do you just keep going through the same thing over and over, or did the guy just get lazy with the underlaying and not, you know what I'm saying? So you have to deal with the relationship of the text to the music, which is an issue in itself. And I don't think that's the kind of issue that can ever be authoritatively decided. I think you just have to use common sense on that.
I was just wondering if there's any identifiable historical or social movements that would have encouraged this trend to the forefront?
It is clear that there was a poetic tradition in Italy, a poetic tradition of Italian poetry by Italians in Italy at this time. And it is also known that it was not uncommon for that poetry to be sung. There is a real dearth of Italian musicians who knew how to notate in Italy at this time. French music was all the craze. Throughout music history, there have been various times when French style has just kind of asserted its superiority, frankly. And so even people who were working in Italy, a lot of them were of French background. And if they weren't a French background, they didn't want to buck the trend, and they would use a French style. But we do know that there is this poetic tradition, and that a lot of this music was sung. And so we put that aspect together with the fact that there's such a wide variety of music in this manuscript to make us think that those two aspects are related. That maybe some of the melodies that we see here, particularly to the simpler pieces, were actually the kinds of melodies that they would have sung to the poetry. The fact that the manuscript has such a wide variety of music in it is pretty telling, because if it had a really limited style of music, then it probably would have been from one moment in time, maybe from one geographic area, but because it has such a variety of styles, and again, you can't prove this, but it's probably the case that because it has such a wide variety of styles, it represents a longer period of time and probably a wider geographic area. So we try, you see what we tried to connect those two together.
How would this music originally been performed? Would it have been mixed voices or male voices, instruments?
the assumption is, which may be completely wrong, but the assumption is that the cantus would have been performed by a singer, and the other voices would have been played on instruments. And that assumption is made based on the fact that the upper voice is the only one that has any text underlaid. But that's a pretty questionable assumption. For one thing, it wouldn't be hard when the tenor is moving in parallel, as it oftentimes does with the cantus voice. It wouldn't have been hard for the tenor to be sung. And furthermore, the person who's singing the cantus is going to have to read this down here and fit it to those notes up there, so why couldn't the tenor do the very same thing? So,
What about boys and women
what's that?
on the top parts?
Women. It would have
Women
been,
would have sung the top parts.
Yeah. In sacred music, that division of genders was pretty strict, but not in secular. Okay. All right.
Thank you.